Hey all, it's Eagle Aaron, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I think anarchists should be endorsing Bernie Sanders, or why social democracy is good for building the kinds of cooperative economies that you need in order to actually implement anarchism. So I made a video and I got some responses that I thought would be worth going over and giving you my thoughts on them. So I haven't actually prepared answers to these. I'm going to first go over the questions that somebody asked me on Facebook. So they gave me 4 questions in numbered points, and I told them I would reply in video because there was a lot to unpack. So the first question is,
why do you think you'd be able to build a mutual aid economy before a revolution? Don't you think the capitalist state would try to stop that?
And yes, I think the capitalist state would try to stop a mutual economy, but I think it would only recognize the mutual aid economy as a threat once it is big enough to actually be taken seriously. It is still capitalism, there is still a state, and doing things through mutual aid does go against those, but mutual aid is a value that social democracies claim to value. They claim to like people being empowered and stuff. And so that allows it to not look like a threat until it's actually big enough to be taken seriously. Now, if you were under a different kind of capitalist government, whether that be state capitalist, neoliberal, or fascist, or neo-feudal, I guess, but in all of those, you're going to have a way harder time building that kind of cooperative economy. So it's not a case of saying that you're immune from the difficulties of capitalism on building this, but let's remember, we're talking about revolutionary action here. We're talking about something radical, e.g. fixing the root causes of problems, not just the symptoms, and capitalism is designed in a certain way. So we are going against that design, and there's no safe way of building socialism. So I'm not saying that social democracy is safe, I'm just saying it's more safe than the alternatives. Question 2 was,
you say you would have to wait until such an economy exists before you can talk about overthrowing capitalism in the state. Don't you think people would only get involved in that kind of movement if they had an anarchist worldview?
I think that you don't need an anarchist worldview to get involved in cooperative economy. And I think once your cooperative economy has gotten big enough that you can actually start talking about overthrowing capitalism in the state, then you are talking about it in the context of switching to that cooperative economy, not just out of the blue. So I think trying to get people to want to overthrow the government is not actually the right way of going about it. Rather, get them to participate in and see the value in and therefore believe in the cooperative economy, and they would hopefully enjoy participating in it so much that they would want it to grow. And it will get to a point where it starts to threaten capitalism, and at that point you can say, hey, maybe we should switch everyone over to this, but then you're doing it because of how good your economy is working, that it, you want the efficiency it's giving you in every part of your economy. So yeah, I say you have to wait until such an economy exists before overthrowing capitalism in the state, because I think that only once you have it do you actually have anything else to switch to. And I think participating in that cooperative economy is beneficial to those that participate in it, regardless of whether it ends up taking over the full economy or not. Number 3.
You think social democracy is alright because it's not too authoritarian, but if you look at the history of social democracy, it is one of them attacking and betraying the workers' movements when they get too militant. From the SDP using the Free Corps to attack the German Revolution, to the Labour Party using the army to break up strikes. Why do you think social democratic governments don't do things out of profit? These governments still have a capitalist economy, they still suffer from the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and will have to attack living standards to keep the economy going.
Now, that sounds to me like laissez-faire style economics, where you think austerity actually helps the economy. This isn't the case. social democracies are actually the best systems for the economy. And yes, it is capitalism, so yes, there is eventually going to be that conflict between profit and worker. But a social democracy shouldn't be seen as a system that you set up and then you forget about it and let it just keep going and then act as if you're surprised when it starts decaying. Rather, it's going to require constant effort and activism. And if you have a movement for people for progressive change in your region and you achieve a social democracy, if you then sit down and relax and be like, yo, we won, it's over, no more hard work needed. Yes, it's only a matter of time before it's going to decay, but that's because you've now stopped applying pressure. What you need to do to avoid the decline is to keep applying pressure. When the capitalist class tries to wear down those victories that you've won, you need to oppose it with direct action and be radical about it. And you need to keep putting pressure on politicians to keep listening to the people and keep primarying them and getting fresher people in, instead of acting like you've achieved what you needed to and all the work is over. No, the work has only begun. Social democracy, it is an attempt to achieve a working society, but it should be done with the understanding that is unattainable under capitalism. So you are going to have to keep putting in effort indefinitely. You will never run out of needing to have a very strong activist movement, and you need to keep it going even once you've achieved your social democracy. And the longer you can keep it going, the longer you can apply that pressure, the more time you have to build these cooperative economies, so that when eventually you do fail and eventually the capitalist class does take over again, you now have this economy that is going to offer you a buffer from their class war and give you the opportunity to expand it and eventually overtake them. So what do you do when the social democracy tries to whittle away those freedoms? You throw all their rhetoric back in their face and you say to them, look, you said you're for this, but now you're doing this. You said you're for that, but now you're doing that. And they're going to either have to out themselves as no longer being social democrats, because you have to be caring about social justice to be taken seriously with that label. So they're going to out themselves as actually being neoliberals and therefore targets for being primaried and getting out the way, or they're going to have to give in to that pressure. So yeah, point 4.
Why do you see politics through the idea of the Overton window and incrementally moving things to the left? Do you not think people will think that you're full of shit for trying to get them to vote for something that you think is shit? What makes you think social democratic governments betraying workers will make them go more to the left? It could easily lend to them moving to the right and seeing socialism as the problem.
Okay, so the first thing is that why am I thinking of things along terms of the Overton window and moving people left? I think it's a pretty useful tool of analysis. Yes, it is pretty simplistic, but if you think about the goals of getting freedom from capitalism and freedom from the state as being your furthest left position, and you see complete control by fascists of the state and capitalism as being the other end, both of those I believe are possible and you can connect them. And so that's why it's a useful tool, because it actually works as an analytical tool. Now, it isn't going to give you the most nuanced outcomes, but it's a starting point and we've got to use some tools. If you have a better idea than the Overton window for framing this, please let me know. But I think it's quite useful and it helps us to picture what's happening. Because, for example, with the Overton window, when it's moving right, how it moves right is they are continuously calling things that are, less and less left to be the furthest left you can go. So, I would argue that an egoist communist and anarchist and socialist society is the furthest left we can see you going, at least. And So that should be what people think of when they think left, but it's not. Now, you could go a little bit further right and look at something like social democracy. Now, social democracy, I would say, is kind of centrist, but leaning towards the right because it's capitalist, but it is a lot further left than the rest of capitalism. So if you point to social democracy and you say that's left, now you've cut off the entire, the framing has cut off the entire discussion and debate regarding anarchism, because you've now said that the left is social democracy, implying that, there isn't other stuff further left. Now you could go even further, and what's been done a lot in the USA is to then point to neoliberalism and say that's left. So like the Democratic Party has been a pretty neoliberal party for quite a while, but has still tried to claim the label of being leftist and has still been called leftist by a lot of people. But that's neoliberalism. That's like almost all the way going towards the right now, and it can work the other way. And so opening up the Overton window is more about opening up the range of possible systems. And so the Overton window describes people's limited knowledge of the options out there, and expanding those options is the first step towards getting people to consider and talk about them. If they don't even think those options exist because they are outside of that Overton window, you can't even talk to them about it.
Do I think people will think I'm full of shit for trying to get them to vote for someone that I think you should?
So, for example, are people going to think I'm full of shit for telling people to vote for Bernie, even though what I really want is socialist anarchism? I don't think so, because I can tell them why. I can say, I'm voting for Bernie because I think that the socialist anarchism that I want is going to be easier to achieve with someone like Bernie in power opposed to the alternatives. I don't think people are going to think you full of shit if you have a good reason for why you have your position. Now, they might not agree with your position or your logic, and you should be open to criticism on it, but you have every right to take a stand and to say, this candidate's going to be helpful to what I want to see achieved. Don't be afraid of that, I think. And then the last part of that question.
What makes you think social democratic governments betraying workers will make them go more to the left? It could easily lend them to moving to the right and seeing socialism as the problem.
So what I would argue is, once your social democracy has begun to repress the workers, it is outing itself as being hypocritical and outing itself as not being really for the people. And so I think as long as your Overton window includes things that are left of social democracy, then people are more likely, who are in favor of social democracy, or the values of it at least, because maybe there's business people who are in favor of the stability it brings. But the people who actually value the justice it brings are going to see even more justice possible on the left. So if the social democracy ends up being a horrible mess, which it could very likely become, although I would argue it's never going to become as much of a mess as state capitalism, neoliberalism, or fascism, but when it becomes a mess, or when it starts going towards neoliberalism, then people are able to contrast that with the things that they preach, to say you're a hypocrite for saying you want justice and then acting that way, and oh look, the anarchists have a way of doing it that will achieve that justice, and they can move left. And if they move right, I think if people move right or left, it's got more to say about them than anything else. And I think we need to apply social pressure on people to move left. I did talk about this before, actually, how even in the most authoritarian societies in the world, there aren't necessarily leftist movements there. So you can't claim that just having a very far-right government is going to push people left. And for the same reason, I'd say you can't expect any left-style government to push people right. I think people are always either going to be right or left personally. They may shift personally. Changes in worldview take a long time. Your mind, think of how long it takes you to break a habit. Now, think of how many habits you would have as an ideology, habits of thought. You'd have so many truths that you've internalized that you need to undo, deconstruct, unpack, and abandon and let go and learn something new. And you'd have to do that over and over and over for all those things you've been misinformed and miseducated on. And that's going to be a process that takes you a long time. So you can argue for both social democracy and your further left position at the same time. People who are ready for the social democracy are going to be like, I don't know about that, but I agree with you on that, and vice versa. Diversity of tactics. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next comment, and this comes from Reddit. And this comment had a lot of negative points, and it was by someone called Obvious Stalinist. So let's see how it goes.
I find it incredibly strange that anarchists fall into the pits of parliamentary centerism. There is nothing about Bernie that's good. His state is the American settler colonial state.
Like, I'm going to just reply as we go. Okay, so
Nothing about Bernie is good.
if you're comparing Bernie to anarchist socialism, hell yeah. He falls short on every single parameter there. If we're talking about Bernie versus Trump, holy crap, you couldn't be more wrong. Yes, there is these institutions that are going to take a long time or a lot of people power to change. Bernie's trying to get that people power going. The policies he's advocating for, like literally if Bernie got into power and did absolutely nothing, he would be far, far, far better than a right-winger or Trump or even a centrist Democrat, because doing nothing at least keeps you where you are. Centrists, moderates and right-wingers, neoliberals, fascists, conservatives, all of them want to pull right. They want to go further right. Social democracies, unfortunately, have rightness built into them. They are inherently right, but they're trying to go left. And so if you're going to argue that actions have no results, that cause and effect doesn't exist, that material differences in decisions and resources and budgets and things like that have no effect, I don't really want to debate with you, because my philosophy is based on the fact that there is such a thing as cause and effect, that causality exists, and that things make a difference. So if Trump is going to get into power and he's going to start telling like his agencies to go easy on white supremacy but hunt down black identity movements, Bernie's going to get into power. He's going to say, go after the white supremacists and let's protect the black identity movements. And now you're going to try and tell me that that is not going to make a difference. That, yes, top-down doesn't fix things, but it sure as shit does make a difference, okay? There's like a level of cognitive dissonance I can't get on board with, claiming that there's no difference between someone like Bernie and someone like Trump. So is there any good in Bernie? Well, is there more good in Bernie than any alternative to vote for? That is the question. You can't hold people up to candidates' options that don't exist. So if you don't have like an anarchist socialist running on a platform of total decentralization, of breaking down all your policies of the state and making them community and mutual aid based, if you have someone running like that, and then you can call that good, sure, then Bernie's not good. But you don't have that candidate. The furthest left you've got is Bernie. And you, even if he's not good, he's the best you got.
His state is the American settler colonial state.
So what he's trying to do, major prison reform. What he's trying to do is give indigenous communities a voice, and the policies he wants to implement are going to help the victims of colonization far more than the rich. He's redistributing wealth from the people that profited off of colonization to the victims of it. That's what his policies are doing in effect. They predominantly help those who are poor, which have, because of these structures, the colonial state made it so that POC and marginalized people are the ones who are generally poor. So yes, it's a colonial state, but Bernie is going to at least undo some of its colonial policy. Let's go back to the comment.
His armed forces are the US state armed forces. The interests he serves are the same as any other candidate.
Now, I would argue that that is denial of material reality, because think of it this way. If you were to run for office what are going to be your motivations in doing XYZ? Now, are we led to believe that Bernie has an ideological affinity that is so high for implementing the atrocities of the US state that he will totally risk losing his candidacy by only taking small donor money, denying all big industry money, denying super PACs? He doesn't want to take any of that money because he wants to be able to work for the people and not for donors. So you're arguing to me that the person that takes the big money interests, that takes the super PAC money, that takes the big donor money, that has fundraising where they sell tickets for thousands of dollars and chat to the candidates and tell them, oh, don't worry, I'm not serious about all the progressive things. Bernie doesn't do that. And you're telling me the candidates that do that and Bernie are going to have the exact, same policies. You're saying that
He has the same interests as them.
so when they are going from fundraiser to fundraiser and promising donors nothing's going to... Somehow those are representing the same interests as someone going from worker movement to worker movement, trying to bolster unions, trying to get minimum raised wage, and these people have the same interests. Why is Bernie acting like he is pro-worker if his interests actually aren't? Why is he not being more like an Obama who is going to promise you all the world but then still be taking the money and be telling donors that things are chill? What Bernie does, he incites people against the billionaires. He incites people against the establishment. If his interests are truly the same as all the other candidates, he's not showing it. And I would argue we need to be material in our analysis and take what he's actually doing, not some conspiracy theory of him secretly not having the interests that he evidently does have. Are they the interests of anarchists and socialists? Not really. But they are the interests of attempting to achieve some kind of social justice and some measure of balance to capitalist economies. Although that isn't the model that we want to implement, it's still better than the alternatives. And it's going to give you more resources, more time, and more legal protections to build the real stuff.
Social democracy is the moderate wing of fascism.
That's a very interesting take, because if you're saying it's the moderate wing, what are you calling the left wing of fascism? Because I would argue that social democracy in some ways is further left than state capitalism. So I would actually argue state capitalism is the moderate wing of fascism, and social democracy I would argue is actually the left wing of fascism. And the reason I would say that is because I would say all capitalism is inherently fascist. But what other options do you have? Do you have an option of not capitalism? No, you don't. You got state capitalism, neoliberalism, fascism, neo-feudalism, if you want to just give corporations all control, or social democracy. You don't have alternatives to the state and capitalism yet to move to, so it has to be one of those. And out of those options, the least fascist is social democracy, because it is trying to promote some kind of social justice. Every other of those is denying some form of social justice. The authoritarian state capitalists, they deny democratic organizing. They deny you the ability to fight for workers' rights because they are apparently already having given the workers everything the workers need, which is a load of rubbish. But in neoliberalism, you're all really poor. You all are under a lot of bad economic policies that are making it hard to get a job, hard to get an education. Under fascism, you got to be privileged or you just get thrown under the bus. Social democracy is literally the only one that actually makes an attempt at justice and fails from its own internal conflicts, not from stated goals of failing, like let's go fail together. Let's go succeed in capitalism is in a sense saying let's go fail, but state capitalists are like, let's go fail in capitalism and fail in denying you any kind of agency. And neoliberalism, let's fail at capitalism and let's fail at any kind of justice and balance to who's wealthy. And fascism is like, we love we love it when you fail, and I'm going to try my hardest to make you fail. And even if that makes the whole system fail, stuff it. At least I make you fail while I'm at it. So, while there's some inherentness in social democracy of fascism, it is the fascism is hypocritical to social democrats. There's no capitalist economy that has less fascism than social democracy. And so until we have our cooperative economy to switch to, we got to deal with the lesser evil. We just have to, because there isn't any other option. Your society isn't going to abandon competition and exchange and hierarchical organizing overnight. You're going to have to get them to change their minds first. And only then do you even get the option of something that isn't capitalist or fascist at all. Until then, you got to make do with the best options around.
Let me tell you that no amount of social democracy will ever prevent war. Norway had a significant part in the destruction of Libya. Norway has and still sends soldiers to Afghanistan and has sold many millions of dollars worth of bombs to Saudi Arabia.
Again, nobody's saying social democracies are perfect, and I would argue Norway is in decline already. Does it have an active activist movement? Are there regular protests? In a social democracy, there should never not be protests. You finally got in a system where politicians at least pretend to give a crap about the workers, and you're not going to take advantage of that and continuously push for more and more freedom. So if you don't have these continuous processes trying to continually get you more and more freedoms to counteract the decaying that capitalism brings, if you're not doing that, you're going to decay. And I would argue that I don't see a whole lot of protests in Norway, and I'm not 100% sure that they are keeping the pressure on, and it's more than likely they'll decay. And so they are going to take their chances, and if there are no mass movements against those sales of arms, then the arms are going to happen. The point of a social democracy isn't that the politicians are going to do all the right decisions for you. It's that they are going to pretend to do what you want so that you can put pressure on them to try and make them do the things you want. Not because they do it out of the goodness of their heart, but because they've sold themselves on giving a crap about it. And so you make sure that you bring it up to them and get them to actually act on it. Because if they don't, then they get revealed as liars.
Bernie's objective is to integrate the labour struggle into the bourgeois state, and in the long term, this serves reaction and fascism.
I don't think that's the case, because if you organize a union, even if the state is the one that helped you organize it, you can still form that community with your fellow workers, and you can take that outside of the workplace as well. And you can build these cooperative economies as well. The labor union movement, if it gets co-opted into the state, that doesn't really impact you that much, in my opinion, because I don't see labor unions as a revolutionary path. I see a cooperative economy as a revolutionary path. A labor union movement might help you overthrow the state, but it's not going to help you implement this new economy. This new economy is only going to be implemented by people who are specifically unionizing for doing that, which is something the state's not going to do. None of Bernie's unions are probably going to be promoting you creating independence from the state and capitalism. So you can do those in your day job, but on the side, the real work that's getting done is not going to be bound by the plans for unions Bernie has.
Today, the social democracies of Europe face a strengthening tendency towards reactionarisation and militarization, allowed by the one-sided power dynamic between the masses and the bourgeoisie created by social democracy in favor of the bourgeoisie.
Now, I'm not sure why you're saying created by social democracy, because social democracy doesn't create capitalism. Capitalism exists. It existed before social democracy ever did. Social democracy is an attempt at repairing it and doing a better job of handling it, but it doesn't create the bourgeoisie. And actually what it does, compared to everything else, okay, state capitalism just sets up a new bourgeoisie, but the point is that the bourgeoisie hate social democracies. You can go and look how much bias there is against Bernie. Look at all the attack ads, and they really hate him. And that's why I would argue that it's nonsense to say the bourgeoisie wants a social democracy. I would say that's the least favorable system for them that is still capitalist, because it's the one where they get taxed to heck. And if you manage to become bourgeoisie in a state capitalist society, then it's pretty easy going for you, unless you annoy the government.
I think you'll be disappointed by Bernie when it inevitably turns out he can't do anything even if he wanted.
I keep hearing this line over and over again, and it just strikes me as people who have never actually spent any time at all listening to Bernie, because you literally have to turn on any of his speeches for like 2 minutes and he'll have said something in there about him not being able to achieve it without popular uprising, without people getting up and getting engaged. Now, why would you not want people to get engaged? Of course, people getting engaged in politics is a good thing. Are they getting engaged for your particular ideology, for your strain of liberation? Maybe not. But if they're getting engaged to try and achieve some kind of empowerment, some kind of freedom to get more power in their lives, then that can only be a good thing that they are participating. And so even if Bernie gets everyone to participate, that doesn't take away from radical movements, because radical movements shouldn't just be about achieving minimum wage or about ending fossil fuels. Radical change should be about changing the entire way our society and our economy works. Even if you get every single thing Bernie said, there's still thousands and thousands of kilometers left to walk if on the path towards our goals. And Bernie himself is also saying that he can't achieve the things he's saying unless everyone gets active. Now, I often say I think Bernie's going to win, but that's because I see people getting excited and I see these movements starting to grow. Not because I think he's just going to win the nomination and he's just going to make executive orders or something. No. I can see the hope in the people as he speaks to them and they realize that they don't have an entire life of struggle ahead of them, that they might actually be able to achieve some relief. That excites people, and Bernie's polling is going up, but he also has the most active volunteers, he has the most active base, he has the most social media activity, he is getting people engaged. If Bernie didn't run in 2016, someone like AOC wouldn't even be in power. Imagine if Pelosi was able to do all her nonsense without ever getting called out. That's the kind of society that would happen if Bernie hadn't inspired people to run in the first place. And he's doing it again. And the youth vote went up in 2018, and this is thanks to Bernie. Now, you might not like his ideology or you might not like him as a person, but you can't deny the effect he's having on people. You can't deny the amount of people being radicalized by Bernie, because when Bernie says stuff, you listen to it, you hear the values behind it, and the best way to achieve those values are radical. So even though he's only offering a non-radical way of achieving those values that you know can't really deliver them, they are still going to be closer to delivering them than the alternatives, and the values that they are trying to achieve are things that you're going to hear him say, want, and find answers in the radical space. The longer he is able to speak, the more people get radicalized. Would BreadTube even exist if Bernie didn't run in 2016? I know I wouldn't be an anarchist if it wasn't for Bernie. Why? Why does that happen? Why do so many people get radicalized by him? It's because of his message, because he is telling people to get involved. He is telling people that you can't make top-down change, that it must come from the grassroots. Those messages and values are going to be retained in people's consciousness long after Bernie's left the scene.
Social democracy is social fascism, as has been shown countless times throughout recent history and continues to be shown today. Remember the crimes of social democracy and its betrayal.
Social democracy is an ideology, and if you look at societies that actually try to implement it, they have a lot less crimes against humanity and a lot less worker suppression and a lot less fascism than any other mode of capitalism. And so you can look at the things that it fails at and be like, wow, that's not cool. But if you don't have a better system to transition to, what's your options? That's an option everybody in society can get on board with for now. Only after we've convinced them to get on board with something better will we be able to move to that. For now, we have to deal with the options that people are okay with, and this is an option that people can be okay with that is also better than alternatives and way, way, way better than the right wing or what happens if Bernie doesn't win. Hopefully that answers obvious Stalinists' questions. And then I have one more to go through.
I mean, I don't agree with that you shouldn't try to shift the Overton window with parliamentarianism, but there's nothing privileged about social democracy. It's pretty much red fascism, especially in Scandinavia, where the social democratic movement has a very strong and still present relationship with eugenics.
So I would argue that if you have a party that calls itself social democratic, if you have a movement that calls itself social democratic, but it isn't actually trying to achieve a social democracy, or it isn't trying to achieve any kind of social justice, that's a flaw in them not actually sticking to social democracy. And if you had a movement of people for social democracy in those places, they would be protesting against those eugenics. So nobody here, I think, is saying that you just need the politicians in a social democracy and everything else is fine. I keep saying you need the constant pressure of the people. Social democracy, in essence, is like a partnership between direct action by the people and politicians who are open to listening to them. And only when both sides are doing their part do you actually achieve any part of what social democracy wants to achieve. If you just have the politicians without any demand for progress by the people, then all you have is a neoliberal state, basically, that has accidentally got some good policies, but it's going to show its true colors very soon. You need that movement, and if that movement is pro-eugenics, then I don't think we should be calling those people social democrats. I mean, even if they are implementing a system that looks like social democracy, we have to admit to the fact that there's nothing social about eugenics, and that what they're actually doing is probably closer to something like National Socialism. And that is being right-wing but calling it socialist.
Reactionary pundits in the US wouldn't be praising the Nordic model if it didn't serve their interests. The only reason why people think social democracy works is because they outright lie about their poverty statistics. They only measure absolute poverty rather than relative poverty like literally every other country in the world.
Do you realize that Scandinavia isn't the only place in the world that has social democracies? Like South Africa, where I live, is a social democracy. And sure, we have started to decay a bit. But if you look at our constitution, if you look at the rulings our judges make, if you look at the policies our politicians are putting before the people, stuff like national health care, land reform, now the capitalist interests are attempting to stop that. And so we need the direct action of the people to try and push those things through. Sure, we do need that. But we're a social democracy, and it's not based on lying about poverty statistics. We're one of the worst, we may even be the worst country in the world for income inequality. And we don't lie about it. We have really bad unemployment. In the youth population, something like 40% unemployment. We have serious problems, but we understand also we're in a global economy, that when Trump tweets some crap, that it tanks our exchange rates and hurts, when the trade war happens, it hurts our economy too, causes us to go into a recession too. And we understand that what we have for ourselves, what we have under our own control, is what policies we put into place. And that's the value that we get in social democracy. Not in trying to attempt it's a perfect system, but in the tools that it gives us, because it gives us the opportunity to say X, Y, Z should happen and A, B, C should not. And if you live in a neoliberal society, what you're saying is austerity should happen and work upliftment shouldn't. That's the overriding narrative. That's what the government is claiming is going to make things better for people. Now, in a social democracy, the government is claiming that they are going to help the workers and that helping the workers helps the economy. That message and that attempt, if you have the people power behind it, can actually start to redistribute wealth and start to reduce inequality. Now, some people are going to praise the Nordic models because they do have interest in it. And let's be honest, capitalism has interest in maintaining itself. And when things get bad, you do risk things falling apart. You might end up in some kind of Anprim-style society. They don't want that. So if it comes to it, they would rather have something that's a little bit more socially responsible that can keep them rich than something that's going to completely jeopardize their potential for living like gods.
So if you make less than $2 a day, which with European cost of living is an impossibly small amount, then you get on the statistics. But if you're below the actual poverty line that everyone agrees upon, which, believe it or not, a huge amount of people are on, then you're considered middle class according to the statistics.
If Scandinavian countries want to game their stats, then that's pretty crappy, and they should be having protests saying, yo, unemployment is this high, don't tell people it's that low. Hey, that's not the right number to judge poverty by. Where are their movements? Why aren't they protesting? That's what a social democracy is. A social democracy isn't a bunch of politicians calling themselves a social democrats. A social democracy is politicians who are saying that they want to try and achieve some kind of social justice, and then social justice warriors making such a noise that they know what to do and that they can actually have the political energy and the reasons to do it. Social democracy is when people in the party are working class, like AOC and Bernie, not people who are paid off by big donors and have the capitalist class talking to them all the time.
There's homeless refugees in Scandinavia who are not considered poor by the government.
Again, this is like claiming that Scandinavia equals social democracy, and I've already argued why I think social democracies are so quick to decay if there's no movement by the people. That's also why I like Bernie, because he's trying to get the people to get active again, because he knows that it won't be able to do anything without that. And if there's no people power in Scandinavia, guess what? It's not actually going to be a social democracy. Even if it calls itself one, you need people to have a social democracy. Social democracy is a type of government system where the people are raising their concerns. That's why social democracies do things like protect your rights to protest and protect your rights to collaborative bargaining, because they want you to speak out. They want you to try and advocate for your own liberation.
There's no privilege with social democracy, and the few social programs that did exist were no different from the New Deal. It was for relatively well-off white people. Everyone else still got to live in the Depression.
The Green New Deal is going to really help workers. 20 million union jobs, and transitioning away from fossil fuel is going to help the working class not die as much. Things like improved public transport infrastructure, things like raising the minimum wage, and those kinds of things are going to be better than not having them. What are you saying? Do you have something better than the Green New Deal that a politician running for president is advocating for? Or is the Green New Deal the best thing any politician running is offering? Because I think that is actually what it is. I think it's the best thing being offered at the moment.
The only, and I mean only time social democracy has a positive effect is like the first term after the election or so. After that, they immediately shift to the right, and after a few decades, you're actually in a far more repressive system than what you started with.
If your society, if the people movements all sit down and think it's game over, sure, it's going to go down way faster than if they were still there. So if you don't have a social democracy yet, people are fighting for it, you're going to have a society that's better than if you get the Social Democrats elected and then everyone stays at home. Because people being active is the real power generator. Social democracy, the benefit there is they listen to the people, but the people being active is where the power comes from, not the politicians. And so the politicians might be being pulled right and being pulled right, but the people should be pulling them left and pulling them left. And if the people aren't pulling them left, sure, it can go to a repressive system worse than you had before, because maybe before you were trying to pull people left. If you stop trying to pull people left, where do you think you're going to go? It's capitalism, you're going right, you've got to keep pulling people left. The day after Bernie gets elected, you should be saying, thanks for everything you're doing, now give us even more. That's how social democracy is meant to work. And that's even how social democrats themselves talk. They tell you, don't offer middle ground, go for the position that is actually going to fix the problem. Now, their problem-solving skills are limited, but the principles they're teaching at least help people to think of things in a better way, in a more class-conscious way. Even if all you're doing is buying yourself a couple terms to build this cooperative economy, if it then starts regressing, now you can try and transition people onto your new economy. So if you're thinking about giving up all your struggles once they get elected, then why even bother? But if you're trying to build those economies, them getting elected is going to give you the most freedom you've had yet, the most agency, the most resources you've had yet. More people are going to be interested because they've now seen how they can be benefit from leftist policies, and you're going to be able to build your movements faster, and you're going to be able to build that economy faster. Now, if people think they've already achieved all they need, then they're not going to do that. And so you need to be completely silent for that to happen. Because if you are vocal in speaking and showing them that there's a better way, then they're going to want it and they're going to keep pushing for it. But if you have absolutely no radical left voice, then you're going to automatically cut the Overton window off there and start moving to the right. And you've got to keep reminding people that there's something way better than what they have, way better than even social democracy, if you want them to keep wanting more. And by them wanting more, they're going to try to get more. And by trying to get more, you're going to resist the pull to the right, hopefully long enough to build the more that they are hopefully getting involved in, that they are not going to have an easy time getting involved in under anything other than social democracy until you've moved away from capitalism.
One example is healthcare. Medicaid in the US is probably better than the Nordic model's single-payer system because at least the hospitals in the US are receiving funding. In Scandinavia, several hospitals are understaffed and have almost no resources, especially with mental health care. It's Foucault's biopolitics in action. They target poor people with shitty healthcare through budget cuts and let rich people enjoy the good healthcare, so you end up with class discrimination that's actually worse than in the US.
That sounds like complete BS to me, because there's no co-payments, there is no payment at points of access, and there's no premiums. I don't understand how you're saying the rich people get the good healthcare and the poor people don't get good healthcare. Like, then you're not talking about Medicare for all, which is what Bernie's advocating for. I don't know much about Medicaid, but I do know Medicare for all, single payer, is the way to go. And if you don't have a good single payer system, you need to get your movements going, have your protests, and start demanding that the budgets are just, that the budgets help the poor. If you stop fighting for the poor, the rich gonna end up with all the reward. You gotta fight. And it sounds to me like you're blaming social democracy for the lack of fight and thinking that social democracy is the problem, when the problem is actually people not giving enough crap and people not actually trying. And if achieving a social democracy is going to stop people from trying, then whatever it was you're advocating for was obviously different than what Bernie's advocating for, because what Bernie's advocating for is naturally pushing people further left than even he is. The things he says, if you actually took him seriously and wanted to do what he was saying, would be further left than the positions he's actually trying. So people who take him seriously and want the things he wants are already going to be further left than your social democracy, are already going to be wanting more justice than he's offering. So that's my response to some of the criticisms from my video, and hopefully that was interesting, and hopefully that helps you understand more about my position and what I'm advocating for. Thank you so much for watching, and feel free to leave your comments below. Bye.